Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise Your Rights. And today, if you've ever talked to me for 5 minutes, you've heard me say the name Benebell Wen. She is the author of the forthcoming I Ching, the Oracle, which I was pronouncing as I Ching, but now I have learned because I've been watching her on YouTube. This is a new translation to the Book of Changes, and it restores the text to its shamanistic cultural origins, which I'm so excited about. She's also the author of Dao of Craft, which I have personally read. And I can't say that about every book that I talk about on this show, but I've personally read the Dao of Craft and Holistic Tarot. And I have 3 decks of her Spirit Keeper tarot cards. And I cannot say enough good things about her. I won't get into show and tell about all the Benebell Wen things I have in this office, probably within 5 feet of me. But welcome, Benebell. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm very excited to hear about this new book.
Hi, Angela. How are you? Your presence is in my space as well. The keychain that you got me is over there. And then it came with a card and an artwork, and that's up on my altar behind me. You can't see it, but so
that's
mutual
so funny.
Occupation of space.
Yeah, very, very much. A lot of admiration going on here. So, all right, well, let's get into this because the I Ching, which I used to say I Ching. I think is that a me thing or is that the way people normally pronounce it?
I've heard both. I'm not a stickler about it. Communication is key. When people say I Ching, I know exactly what you mean, so it's fine. I Ching. I mean, if you want to get super technical, it's I Ching, which nobody says, right? So seriously, we're fine. And actually, to be even more technical, it's not I Ching, it's Zoe. Zoe is what the book is actually called. So we're fine.
Okay, well, if I ever do want to get all pretentious about this, I'm going to remember that. Be like,
yes,
oh,
exactly.
actually, let me look up in my notes. So, okay.
If you really want to be part of the online Taoist community, you have to be pretentious and mansplain everybody.
Oh, okay. Well, gosh, I'm terrible at that because I usually don't know what I'm talking about, but I can try. Well, tell me a little bit about your spiritual philosophy and how it evolved, and then and maybe how the I Ching kind of connects to this, intersects to this.
I guess I would self-describe as Taoist and Buddhist. And when I say Taoist, I mean I strive for balance and harmony. And I try to think of balance and harmony as the values that I put at the forefront of everything that I do. I don't always succeed because we're human and fallible, but at least I try. And then I say Buddhist from the religious vantage point because I practice meditation, I practice sutra recitations and mantras. So that's fairly Buddhist. So Taoist and Buddhist.
Okay. I like the idea of balance though, because if it didn't shift around, if you didn't have to struggle to stay balanced, it wouldn't be balanced, right? It would just be a state. So
yeah, exactly.
That's good. I guess that's definitely practicing it. How do you, because you live in the Western world, but you practice Eastern esoteric traditions, like the I Ching and things like that. How do you balance those and integrate those?
I struggle, I don't know how I balance it. I think now there's less visible Western esoteric influences in my personal practice than there was before. And I think I do keep them fairly separate. So for example, tarot is very much rooted in the Western occult traditions. And so I'm going to utilize fire, water, and earth, the 4 elements. Whereas anything that gets into the realm of traditional Chinese medicine or the I Ching or Taoist ceremonial magic, I'm going to be working with the 5 alchemical phases, the wuxing. And so I do keep it separate. I don't really mix the two. I think the Western mindset, which is, a legacy from the Enlightenment age, we want to reconcile everything. Everything has to reconcile. So there is that impulse in me to try to figure out the equivalence between the 4 and the 5 and to draw comparisons between Western occult traditions and Eastern occult traditions. But that's not spirituality. For me, that's more of an intellectual exercise.
Okay. Well, this is my big question. I just watched your video where you talk about Zhou Tianxuanhui and what she had to do with the I Ching. And I know that you've talked about her before with you have the I Ching class, like the divination, throwing the yarrow stalks and stuff class, which I really need to finish at some point. And you have references to that kind of the I Ching in the tarot cards that you've built. which is the third iteration of the Spirit Keeper Tarot. Where can you share a little bit about that, like that connection with her and how that influenced what you're doing?
Oh, I mean, she's always been part of my awareness. I mean, you know how if you grow up in particular traditions like Kuan Yin, Kuan Yin, Amitabha Buddha, Amitofo, there's like certain personifications and divinities that have always been part of my life. And then I think just based on who you are, we are going to gravitate toward one versus another. And so I don't think it's too insane or unpredictable that I would gravitate toward Zhou Tianxuan or the Lady of the Nine Heavens. And when you see people who gravitate toward her, oh, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think what I like about her is sometimes Kuan Yin can feel too lofty for me. I'm like, wow, those are ideals I really cannot live up to. And I feel like a lot of shame, self-shame in her presence, like, damn, I'm really not compassionate and unconditionally loving as you. And so I don't feel like worthy to be in your presence. You know what I mean? Like there's just a little bit of that. And same with Amitofo, just a little bit too like high vibe. And I'm not quite there
Yeah.
yet. Maybe later on in my life or another lifetime, I will be able to be in their presence and feel comfortable. But for now, I feel like Zhou Tianxuan has more of a, like, she's more willing to throw down if shit becomes very unjust, you know, and I feel that way. And so because of that, and she leans into the dark and the light in a more balanced way when she talks about yin yang, like the yin and yang philosophy, yin yang shu. And so because of that, it's a little easier as a human with flaws to connect to than, you know, someone like Kuan Yin, who is more aspirational, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I love, and I actually realized we should probably talk about who Shoti and
Oh,
Shwinmi is for people that are watching. So I'm gonna let you introduce her, but I will say one of the things I love is that it's the sword and the healing. Like it is that balance. Like she's aggressive kind of, but also she'll take care of you. But I'm gonna let
she
you talk about who she is.
anyone can talk about who she is. She's described as a shennu, who is kind of, so all we can say about what that really means if you're speaking in English is she's feminine presenting and not of our world. That's all we can really say, because does that word mean that spirit? It can mean consciousness. It can mean a goddess. It can mean a spirit of some kind, an ascended master. Like there's so many ways you can translate that word that it's not easy. And then I've seen so many different translations. Like, for example, from Taiwanese to English, I see just goddess of Zhoutian, and then they don't even translate Zhoutian. So then you don't even know what that is. Is that a place? Is it nine heavens? Is it descriptive? Like, is it a proper noun or is it just a noun? Who knows, right? And
Yeah.
so there's that aspect to it. But she's considered a messenger of a higher mother goddess of some kind, a more primordial mother goddess that's usually attributed to origin chaos, the origins of the universe, which is dark and chaotic and more yin. And that mother goddess, her yin energy is the seed of all of life in the cosmos. And one of her emissaries and her proteges is Zhou Tianxuan, the Lady of the Nine Heavens, or the mysterious Lady of the Nine Heavens. One of her words is xuan, which can mean dark. So dark goddess is a translation you often see. It can also mean occult and esoteric, the mysteries. So xuan also means the mysteries. And so she can be a goddess that is related to the mysteries. In practice, she's often a goddess related to war, because historically soldiers would venerate her. And she was much beloved by soldiers who were headed into war or battle. And then later on, more in terms of the Qing dynasty and more modern times, you're going to see women who venerate her for, they call upon her to fix injustices. So women who are victims of domestic abuse, women who just don't have the power to change the dynamics of their lives, they'll appeal to Zhou Tianxuan to come down and help them rectify or bring justice.
That's awesome. And a lot of times it's women who need the justice, though. Like that's fantastic.
So that's a nutshell. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, then one of my questions was, how does she influence your spiritual practices and your worldview? And I feel like we've kind of gotten into that a little bit, but if you want to go deeper, or we'll move on into holistic tarot, which I'm very excited about as well.
In terms of my worldview, I see her as a teacher. and I see her as a point of inspiration as well. And so this is I hate the whole Eastern Western comparison, but it's hard not to get into that mindset, but like the whole "what would Jesus do" vibe, right? Like, it's so bad. It's a good please do not like requote that. Like, it's a terrible like comparison, but something in that vein where like if you want to figure out how to make decisions in a way that aligns with how you want to be. I look to her for inspiration to make decisions in terms of decisions I will feel proud of, right? And also because she is associated with the mysteries and occult practice, I do invoke her to help guide my spiritual development in terms of occult practices.
Excellent. Because of this conversation right now, I really want to get a "What would Zhou Tian Xunwei" t-shirt made for you and send
No, right? You already have that J, like the what would JTX, you already have that. It's too perfect.
You're like, what does this even mean? All right, let's go to the holistic tarot, which I have raved about. Ironically, that was your first book, but I started with Dao of Craft is kind of how I met you, as a reader. But I want to go for holistic tarot and talk about like your approach to that was incredible. That and the book of maps, there's so much incredible research. And I've read tarot books before, and it's usually like, oh, this means this and this means this. But you deep dive into all the cultural significances and all the research, and it's incredible. And I feel like this is a museum trip. If you really want to get into information, you need to get these books, like Benebell Wen's books. So can you talk a little bit about the holistic tarot? What inspired you to write it? And how do you think it's impacted the tarot community? So I'm going to say, I feel like it's raised the bar like really high.
Well, at the time, I wanted to write a reference book. So I wanted to write a book I wasn't looking to write, a page turner thriller on the tarot. So it is dry. It does lean more academic because it's supposed to be a reference book. You pick it up, you have a question about the tarot, you look for it in the index or the table of contents, and you look it up. And then if there are, like end notes, if there are end notes, you can go find the citation to do more research. That was basically the cut and dry 101 of why I wrote that book. I think at the time I was fresh out of law school. You know how when you go to grad school, you have that training, that sort of research and analysis training. So I applied a lot of that research and analysis training into the tarot. At the time I was debating whether or not to go into private practice or try to become a professor of some kind. So I still had that academia running through my veins. And then instead of applying it to feminist jurisprudence or legal theory, I decided to turn and pivot all of that sort of legal research analysis type training into the tarot. So that's how holistic tarot came about.
That's awesome. Well, and it is like, because like I said, I'd read, books on tarot, and it was like, oh, this is interesting. Yours was like, oh, I have a history lesson, a cultural lesson, all of it is right there. It's so, well, from that, you wrote the Dao of Craft. How do those connect? Because the Dao of Craft is like very different, honestly. It's talking about creating food talismans and a lot of the very esoteric things, where tarot is esoteric, but the Dao of Craft is very esoteric. How did the Dao of Craft come about?
I do think they're very different. And even by my own admission, aside from the writing style, I do think I have a voice. So the writing style, I think you can pick up on. But beyond that, I don't know that you would be able to tell that those two books are by the same author, because they do go in very polarizing directions. I think with the Dao of Craft, with holistic tarot, it is more clinical. I wanted to take out spirituality, and you would have no idea what my spiritual or religious leanings are, or even what my beliefs are from reading holistic tarot. In fact, you would probably think I was agnostic. Whereas from the Dao of Craft, you will definitely see where my spiritual and occult leanings go. And the audience, I felt like, was different too. For the Dao of Craft, how that book came about was I was thinking about how there are so many questions about my own ancestral lineage and spirituality that I had, but I wasn't able to ask like people who had primary source knowledge on it, because my grandmother had passed on by then. And so I was like, I don't want that to happen and repeat that cycle of where, Taoist mysticism is such an oral tradition that most of the pillars of knowledge only pass on that knowledge through oral transmission. And I kind of wanted to break that cycle because I couldn't just every time I wanted to know something, go literally physically go back to Taiwan, go up a mountain and find somebody and ask the question. And so I was like, well, let me do my best to document in writing everything I have learned and all the answers I have gathered over the decades into a book to give on to a little sister, to give on to the next generation of Asian Americans, little sister in a figurative sense, or a child in a figurative sense. The Asians who want to connect to their ancestral lineage, but don't have like the personal ability to do so.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic too, because in my mind, you're kind of like a champion of unmystifying the mysteries, which is we don't have that option, like you're saying. But I think, especially right now, we really seem to be needing that spiritual grounding. And I think that's kind of one reason why the world seems to be a bit off axis with some of the things that are going on. But without dwelling into that too much, how about the I Ching then from those two books? Because you actually retranslated the I Ching. And I'm super excited to find out because I've never thought of the I Ching as being shamanistic at all. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, in my mind, it's a very dry and esoteric thing. And then shamanism is something completely different. So what inspired that? How did it come from those two books? And then I'd love to hear about the shamanistic aspect of it.
What's interesting is that's not new, at least in the Chinese language. I mean, I definitely didn't come up with that idea. I'm regurgitating ideas from Chinese academics and sources. So if you just off the shelf randomly pick up the most popular or most well-known 15, 20 books in the Chinese language, traditional Chinese, on the I Ching commentaries, no less. So people who are specializing in like I Ching studies and what they have to say about it. They talk about Fuxi and King Wen as shamanistic kings. They talk about the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty as being shamanistic oriented, and therefore the I Ching began as a shamanistic text. How that got erased over the millennia and then translated into English as not even shamanistic, I don't know what happened there. And so I don't see that as something I'm bringing to the table. It's more like, hey, wait a minute, why haven't we talked about this in English when it is the most common and basic concept when you talk about the I Ching in Chinese? And so that's the reason I'm bringing it up.
Yeah.
And then also when I did the translations, none of it is unique. A lot of it, what I did was I said, I'm only going to take commentaries and interpretations of the text from Chinese sources. And also Korean and Japanese sources. There's a whole story there where people can make the argument that a lot of the integrity of how the I Ching was interpreted pre-Cultural Revolution was preserved better by the Korean and the Japanese cultures and their scholars than it did in China. So there is definitely that argument. So if you want to see and make sure you have a multifaceted interpretation and understanding of I Ching, you do need to look beyond just the borders of mainland China. But yeah, so that's kind of where I got into wanting to write the I Ching and write it in English so that I can restore perspectives on it that kind of swing the pendulum back from the Christianized perspective of the I Ching.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's where a lot of that kind of got washed out, was because it was Christianized translations, and maybe we don't want to have all that funky shamanism stuff in there because that's weird, and so it just kind of, we just want the other stuff.
Yeah.
So, well, can you tell us a little bit about it? Because it's releasing. When is it releasing? Like very soon, like within days, right? The I
This
Ching?
month. Yeah, this month, later on, like the 20 something of September.
Okay, yeah. So can you tell us a little bit, like give us some insight? And the link is in the description, by the way, if you want to go find this book and get it. All of Benebell's books are linked in the description. But can you tell us a little bit about it? I actually have the table of contents right here, and I'm just like, there's so much here. That's from what I expected from the other two books. You've way outdone yourself with this one.
Oh, really? Oh, okay. What about this book? Let's see. Well, so one of the reasons I wanted to focus on the I Ching is that like inner academic in me. And so in Confucian classics, there's the five classics that correspond with Wuxing, the wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. So you have the book of songs. Book of songs is all a book of poetry. And so somebody who is more literary minded into the literary arts would probably, if they are into that Confucian academic mindset, they want to write their commentaries and do a dissertation, basically, write their dissertation to interpret the book of songs. You have a book of documents, which is political science and philosophy. You have the book of rites, which is more civic duties. And then you have book of seasons, which is history. So if you're a historian or an archaeologist, you're going to want to go into the book of seasons and write your dissertation or commentation or commentary on that. Then water, which is mystery, uncertainty, darkness, because we associate water with dark blue and black in terms of colors, not the light blue that you see in Western esoteric traditions. So water is associated with the book of changes. And the book of changes relates to mysteries. So given my interest in the occult, which of those five books do I want to write my commentaries on as an academic? It's going to be the I Ching. So that's the reason I wrote the book. I wanted to bring in half of it as, sort of laying out the foundation, the cultural and historical context of the I Ching, because so many of the lines reference very specific mythology, specific legendary characters. So without knowing their story, you don't have that background context that a native Chinese person would have. You see certain words, if you're from the culture, you go, oh, that's that. The whole story gets transplanted into one word, right? But if you're only from the Western culture, you don't know that story. So that one word doesn't hold the same weight of meaning because you don't have that cultural knowledge. So I wanted to bring in all of that so you have that context when you read the actual Book of Changes. So that's why the book is 900 pages when only half of it is the translations.
No, that's fabulous though, because you bring up a really good point. In your culture, like we could say in our culture, oh, well, that's just a Goldilocks situation. And you would know exactly what I'm talking about, or anybody who's familiar with that. But if you're not from our culture, it would be like, what?
Yes.
So that's fabulous that you did put that in there, because it makes it a comprehensive, like we will all be able to understand this kind of woo-woo mystical thing that we really haven't had access to.
I hope so.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited. Changing gears a little bit about books, we have shared a book with Unquiet Spirits. And in that book, you wrote a really personal experience, kind of at an intersection of your spiritualism and identity. And I want to talk about that a little bit. Can you summarize that essay a little bit and some of the key messages from that?
Oh, okay. Well, it's just a story from my childhood. It's something that happened. And there's two ways to read the story because it is a true story. It's a memoir. It's just an account of something that happened as a personal essay. So every event in the story that I tell can be explained from a rational, mundane, psychology-based, perspective where there's nothing, you can strip out the woo completely and explain that story. A psychologist or a therapist can explain what happened there. And you can also read it as a ghost story and understand exactly why a particular cultural background will view certain things as demonic or demonic possession or spirituality, exorcism. You can see that influence, and then I hope it causes you to take pause and wonder where you land. And I hope you don't know exactly where you land. Like, is it really, I can explain it through psychology, or did something else happen here? And I hope you don't know the answer yourself. So that's,
Yeah.
and that's scary. Like there's horror in not knowing. And so that's kind of where that came from. And yeah, the story is related to something that, you could say it's the cycle of alcoholism, right? But in that it runs in families. People do say alcoholism runs in families. And so you can say it's that story, and it's just a tragic event of alcoholism that repeats itself over many generations. Or you can talk about demonic possession.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that is kind of where I do end up from that essay, is kind of it is, oh, it's easily explained, but is it? But then the bigger question is how much that we easily explain through, say, psychology might be something else, or vice versa, so it's a really, that's why I love the essay so much. And I'm really glad it's in the book, because it does bring up that question without deciding for the reader, letting the reader decide all of that.
Right.
From that story that is in your essay, how did that kind of bridge, did that have an effect on who you are today and the spiritual work that you do? Like kind of that, like did it intersect and is it an influence or?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's not just that story. I think that story is just a slice of life fragment of what
Mm,
childhood was like for a lot of us, who grow up in this
mm-hmm,
tradition. And so it shows how the quote unquote magical and the mundane, there's really no fine dividing line between the two. They overlap one another, and you can explain anything that you experience in life through that magical, mystical perspective, or you can just explain it through what you know of modern day science and psychology. And
mm-hmm,
so my spirituality, my everyday life is like that. It's just so interwoven that there really isn't, I can't point to something and say, this is completely stripped and void of any of my spiritual gnosis of how the world works. And there's nothing that is entirely, oh, this is just religion and this is not in any
mm-hmm.
way actively applicable to my everyday life and my mundane. Everything that I do that's spiritual and religious is very practical.
I like that, which, I mean, the two are so interwoven. Like my mom was a pharmacist and educated and well read, but we also constantly talked about the ghosts that lived in our house with us and the dreams that we would share, like that kind of thing. It is so interwoven, you can't really separate it.
Mhm.
So, which is awesome in that essay. It kind of brings that out as it's a good shared experience.
I'm glad.
All right. I know you were talking about the I Ching, but one of the things that you're super like famous for and popular is the Spirit Keeper Tarot, which I would love to talk about just a little bit. It has incredibly I think you called it one time the occult tech, and I'll just hold up a random card. There is so much symbology and everything in there. Can you talk a little bit about the Spirit Keeper Tarot? Um, why it's gotten so much attention? How you came up with that you should do this and put all of the symbology and everything into it?
How its origins, I think the most comprehensive yet concise way I can describe how it came to be is I think anyone interested in the tarot has some like lofty dream to create their own tarot deck. So I've always wanted to create my own tarot deck, but I didn't feel like I had the personal skill set or tools, or I didn't even know where, like, I just didn't, there's no way, like, from point A to point B, I couldn't even see the road. So there's no way for
Mm-hmm.
me to really create a tarot deck. And then what I did was I not prayed, but like, yeah, also prayed, where I said, I invoked the divine and said, I have this one thing I want to do. I don't know how to do it. However you guide me, I promise I will do it. I will do the work. I will, put in the elbow grease to do the work, but I just need guidance. I don't even know where to begin. I don't even know where my first step should go. Right. And then I felt like once I very sincerely, and I think that's the key, right? We have to be self-aware enough to know when we're being authentic with ourselves and when it's a
Mm-hmm.
very superficial, you don't really mean what you say, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think when I achieved that moment of I meant what I said, everything clicks into place. And then the road reveals itself. And then you walk the talk. You really have to. So if you do walk the talk and you do the things that spirit says, you need to do this, you need to do that, and you do it, then it just kind of falls into place. And then I didn't feel like I really needed to work hard. I just
Mm-hmm.
had like there's a difference between working hard in labor and then just doing the work. I don't know how to
Yeah.
parse the difference, but there was. So I just did the work, but it didn't feel like I was working too hard for it. And then the tarot deck happened.
Yeah, which is amazing. And I think in the beginning of this, I'm showing off a couple more images of it. In the beginning, I believe you claimed that you were not an artist.
Yeah.
And when you look at this, you're like, what? Feel like I'm being punked here because this looks like a really well practiced artist making these.
I would
So,
still say I'm an illustrator. So that's illustration work. And I think people, okay, there's a lot of talent that goes into art to be an artist. But
mhm,
illustration work, I think you can say it's more technical. There's a lot
mhm,
of technical skill that you just need to sit down, do the rote sketching and practicing to get the mark making and the line work down pat, like human anatomy, understanding human anatomy. That's very
mhm.
technical. I don't think there's
Yeah.
talent to that. You just really need to do the work and be able to rote study that. So that's what I did.
Mhm,
So I think of myself more as an illustrator than I do an artist because I don't see that as a fine art stack. It's more illustrations
mhm.
of ideas.
Yeah, well, fantastic illustrations. I'm gonna stay with artists, but also I see where you're
Oh,
coming
thank
from
you.
with that. It is very amazing, the creativity and everything. One of the things I like about the Spirit Keepers Tarot is the accessibility. Like I picked up the deck, and usually I kind of have to live with the deck a little bit to get to know it, and but the Spirit Keeper Tarot picked it up, kind of felt like I'm gonna have to build this relationship. Boom, relationship is already there, super accessible for a beginner, but also there is so much woven into it. What how is did you do that on purpose? Because it's kind of like for newcomers and seasoned. It's kind of an all around, like you said, occult tech. It's all the different traditions in there. I'm not going to say all, but many different traditions woven into that. How did you do that on purpose? Was that the plan, or was that just kind of a guided?
Oh, that was definitely the plan. I think it was one poking fun, but also taking seriously the age-old idea of, oh, the ancients knew more than we did.
Mhm,
Like you look at every century, there is this idea, the Enlightenment age that we just talked about, the age of reason. The whole thing was the ancients knew better, which is why they kept going back to the ancient Egypt, right? And so there's that
mhm,
concept, or ancient Greece. And so I wanted to play with that idea, but at the same time, take it seriously and figure out if my thesis is that there is a universal theology, then that means there are going to be similar undercurrents in the theology of various parts of the world. And so that was more of the homework that I did for myself. I did do the research. I went into, historical records, university press academic publications. I really vetted who I was citing from, making sure that they were more own voices, which was really
mhm.
hard. I don't have as many own voices publications as I would like, and I couldn't find them. That's a whole nother problem to talk about. So there
Yeah,
was that archaeological records. So looking at museum pieces and then what was written about the museum pieces and using that as inspiration for the illustrations. But I really want to go back to the cradles of civilization and what the indigenous beliefs were of various traditions around the world and how that might come together as tarot archetypes. So yeah, that was on purpose for
yeah.
sure.
That's awesome. Well, and it is like I have learned so many things and researched so many paths that I never thought I would look at because of this deck. So yeah, but I will move on because we are here to talk about the I Ching. I feel like we've kind of talked about this because we've talked about Taoism and Buddhism, but do you have any particular influences or inspirations in your spiritual journey that have affected you, like people or works or practices?
I think my culture and my ancestral heritage. So those are the primary influences. My mom, because of who she is and the environment that she grew up in with my grandparents, and even what you heard from the story from Unquiet Spirits, the family background specific. My mom always was more tuned in to put it crudely, the dark side. And so, because if you have that very personal hyper awareness of the darkness in the world, you overcompensate and you really want to make sure there's, like, on a very extreme level, goodness to
Mhm,
overcompensate for how much darkness you see in this world. And so I grew up always being pushed to go to Buddhist monasteries and spending, because Buddhism is sort of that religion that tends to be more, that counterpoint to the demonic possession, exorcisms, and darkness. And so she pushed us into the world of Buddhism in terms of, learning the religion and having to spend time, cleaning temples and doing all of that. And so even though I thought I resisted a lot of that education and indoctrination from Buddhist temples, monasteries, shifu, the nuns and monks, I ended up more indoctrinated than I would have liked because I find myself like so heavily influenced by Buddhism. So I think I can't help but, have to acknowledge that Buddhism is a very heavy influence.
Yeah, I think when we're younger, we think we're not going to have any of that stuff with us. And then as we grow older, we're like, oh, wow, I am just like that.
Shit, like I am really
How did this
indoctrinated.
happen? Well, how do you balance, you have the very scholarly approach to the occult and esoteric. How does that inform your personal spiritual practices, or do they, or are they just two separate things?
I think of it as the same approach that I bring to work-life balance. We all have, you have your job life and then you have your home domestic life, and they're very different. They tend to be polarities. How do you balance the two? I mean, it's like a very difficult question to answer. You're constantly trying, but that's sort of what you have to do. And so I see that as well. A lot of times they tip off balance because there is just too much in the occult space that you really don't have the tools in psychology or science, or even in terms of systematic approaches that you learn from academia to really be able to reconcile in the occult world. Occult is more like I felt it. Now it's like I feel something. It's completely real to me. How do I explain that to Angela, to you, so that you get it? It's not always easy in the occult world because there is this understanding that you have to experience it to know, right? And
Exactly.
that doesn't fly in science, academic space. Like that doesn't fly. So how do
Yeah.
you bridge the two? And that's the eternal question that we struggle with. And so that is that work-life balance that you have to try to figure out how to get to. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, so far, I think you're doing a fabulous job from the products that you're producing. So I think what you're doing is working. Well, I guess I have a final question, and that is basically, what other projects do you have? Like, obviously, the I Ching link is going to be below in the description, along with links to your other books, your website, social medias. What else do you have coming up, or do you? I know I've seen some pretty interesting pictures on Instagram
Well,
of other photos.
I'm illustrating an Atea deck, which is just a very different vibe, even different muscles that I'm utilizing to create the Atea. I felt like the Spirit Keeper's Tarot was deeply personal. It was more esoteric leaning. I'm not going in that direction for the Atea. I hope the Atea is more fun and light. And, there's a lot of fun lore around Atea. He was dismissed by Elvis Levy and Wade. Like he was written very negatively about by so many of the occultists that we technically, that we admire, because they said that he over commercialized the tarot. And then, he bastardized the tarot because he switched around, like he did a lot of willy-nilly to the tarot architecture and the meanings and all of that. But then at the same time, all of these quote unquote so-called serious occultists like Levy and Waite, and also Pappas and McGregor Mathers, they borrowed very heavily from Atea card meanings to write their own works in the Golden Dawn. So a lot of what we think and we attribute to the tarot card meanings come from Atea. The concept of reading with reversals comes from Atea. And so how do you ignore or deny the indelible influence on serious tarot that Atea had, even though he was so dismissed? They would even, like, ad hominem attacks, like they would call him, oh, the hairdresser, as if that was like an insult, because they're saying how he doesn't have that academic Oxford rigor. How would he be able to know anything about history or Hermeticism or philosophy? So they really tried hard to dismiss his learned knowledge in astrology and tarot and the occult sciences. So I just thought it would be a very fun thing to revive his tarot and just play with that. That's the
Oh,
project
I
I'm
think
working.
that's fabulous. And how convenient it is that, like, oh, you just don't know, but we're going to borrow all of your studies and your work and your inspiration there.
Exactly.
Well, that's fabulous. I guess that's just in process. So you don't really have a date to give us or a timeline or anything like that. But
It
if
is
you want to see
slow
this,
going. I only have
you'll
about
find,
30 cards done. It's going to be a while,
oh,
like years while.
yeah, but they're gorgeous. If you want to see that, go to Benebell's Instagram and you will find those, along with like some excellent pictures of what she's been cooking, which always make me hungry and jealous that my food is not that pretty.
It's terrible
Yeah.
branding, right? Like I'm sitting here trying to brand myself as serious occultist, and I'm like, oh, cookies, it is what
But you have to eat, right? What feeds the
yeah, I
occult?
have to eat
That's
a
that
serious
balance,
academic
mind, body.
must eat cookies. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, I thank you for being here. Do you have any messages or anything you particularly want to tell anybody? Like, what if they were interested in getting into, say, the I Ching? What would you suggest to them besides obviously read this book?
Do we have some time? I wanted
Mhm.
to actually,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
actually put the I Ching Book of Changes into practice in terms of, so one of the things that people do is, you know how there's 64 hexagrams, and then the Chinese
Mhm.
lunar solar calendar is 60 years. So there's this thing that we do where we attribute these 64 hexagrams to the sexagenary calendar, the 60-year life cycle. You have a remainder of 4. Those 4 hexagrams are called the 4 perfected hexagrams. And not to get too woo-woo, but here's something really interesting. The theory is that the 4 hexagrams need to be like adjusted to which planet you're on. And these are ancient ideas. So there's this
Oh,
idea
wow.
that first you have to adjust the 4 hexagrams in the Book of Changes to Earth so that it becomes a geocentric point of view. So we use astrology. And so the 4 perfected hexagrams correspond with in astrology, and you use it in both Eastern and Western astrology. I'll use Western astrology terms: the ascendant, the descendant, the imam cheli, and the medium cheli, or the midheaven point. So you have to take those 4 quadrants, you superimpose the hexagrams with those 4 at those points, and then the other 64 fall in line. And now you know every year corresponds with one of the hexagrams. And there's this belief that history repeats itself in this 60-year
Yeah.
cycle. And so if it repeats itself by this theory, you can predict what will happen in every single year based on the hexagram of that year. And the 6 lines correspond with these 6 the 6 like milestones of every single calendar year. So we'll begin with 2020, just because I think that gives us some background. So if you follow that, then 2020 in the Western Gregorian calendar year, you have to convert into the Chinese calendar first, then you convert into the hexagrams. It's hexagram 39, which is an impasse. That was the year of the metal rat. And rats actually correspond with disease. So there's
Yeah.
this idea that, right, okay. And then so what's
Yeah.
interesting is
Bubonic plague and
exactly. The prediction is stand still in progress, movement is blocked. So there's that prediction or prophecy that in 2020, that movement will be blocked. And then the advice that it gives for being able to navigate 2020 was channel power far beyond the reach of the obstruction and grow it outward from within. And that was the advice. So I thought
wow.
that was really interesting. Now, for this year, 2023, then 2023 corresponds with hexagram 42, burgeoning, the year of the water rabbit. And so the 2023 advice or prophecy is this is rebuilding after loss and new opportunities. And then some of the other prophecies for 42 for 2023 is the heart is not steady, adversity to come, but benevolence benefits the heart. And so the
Oh,
advice that the Book of Changes is giving is for this year, benevolence benefits the heart. If you want to find a way to navigate 2023, that's how you navigate it. If you don't have benevolence in your heart, consequences will come. And then the prediction is that as a society, as a human earthly society, we do not have benevolence in our heart, because the prediction the next year over 2024, so if we follow this cycle, will be hexagram 43. That's the year of the wood dragon. So it says warning cry through the capital. And it's about how you want to interpret what it means. Warning cry through the capital. Impending flood, economic inequity, tempting to respond to conflict with arms. And then one of the lines that corresponds with the very end of hexagram 43, so how we're going to end 2024. So the line is, amaranth grows on the continent. Dig, dig, sounding a bark, but no command. So so amaranth is a weed. Amaranth is a very beautiful blossom. So you are attracted to how it looks. You're like, oh, that's a really pretty flower, but it's actually a weed. And so if you let it grow naturally, and you don't contain or control the growth of amaranth, this really beautiful flower, it becomes a weed and it will knock out all growth of any other flower in your garden. And so you have to be, if you are a gardener and you want to grow amaranth, you have to be very careful about how you grow. It's kind of like mint, right? Like it's a great plant to have, but if you're not careful, you're going to have way too much mint. And it's a weed. It's going to kill the growth of anything else you want to grow in your garden. So that's interesting prophecy for 2024 to come. And it says dig, dig. So there's this idea of you better control the growth of what you think is beautiful, because if it goes to access, you're going to be in trouble. And then I also like sounding the bark, but no command. There's this idea of perhaps politicians or people in leadership positions. It's all talk, all rhetoric, and no action. So so you're barking, but there's no coherency or command, nothing actionable from what's happening from the bark, from the sound that you hear. So we'll see what happens. But in general, 2024 is predicted to be a breakthrough year, whereas this year was a year of new opportunities, but also adversity, especially economic adversities. We'll see what happens. But I just love that idea of being able to predict year to year using the hexagrams, and also the presumption that you have to first align it as a dial or compass to where we are, which is Earth. And that implies there's more than just Earth, right?
Yeah, yeah. That's crazy, because especially I'm glad you started with the 2020, because that's exactly what happened in 2020. We did have to reach beyond ourselves, because if you didn't have technology, if you couldn't do something like this, you couldn't do anything. Everything that summed it up. I was going to use the word crazy, but it's not crazy. It's chill. I have goosebumps.
It is chilling. And so when you see that, you're like, oh, so getting that whole calendar and superimposing the calendar years, the hexagrams, it's just a really easy, practical way to just get some quick guidance, predictable guidance on what to do in 2024, 2025, 2026.
Yeah, where should you be putting your energy and your
I think it's creepy because it's like, wow, history really does repeat itself. Like, wow, we cannot learn from our Dharma. We cannot learn from our own mistakes. We're doomed to be idiots.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, wait a second. Does everybody know this? Just read this and stop what you're doing. Do you have that in the I Ching? Like, basically explain all that out so we can do that? Because now I'm like, what about 2025?
I left that chapter. So, well, I mean, I have everything, and then I show the lunar solar calendar, and I give you the 4. So yes, I give you all the tools, but I don't think I reconciled it into what I just did in the last 5 minutes. So I might have to write a blog post or create a video to better reconcile all of that. I think there was a chapter on that. There was a chapter on the I Ching and Akashic records and the Akasha and connecting that to the Bodhisattva of the Akasha. But I took that out at the last minute because it was like, at that point, it was like it was breaching 1,500 pages, and I had to knock it back down to 900. So a lot got left out because at this point, this is no longer a book.
This is the I Ching companion workbook that Benebell will be putting out next year.
Yeah, something like that.
It has been absolutely fascinating, and it's such a privilege and a personal thrill to have you on the show. I can't thank you enough. If you ever want to come back, just say the word. I will drop everything and clear my schedule, because you're an amazing person as well as practitioner, and just in general, I see you as one of those people that just gives and gives and gives. So I think your mom would probably be pretty proud of all the kind of karmic good that you're doing to overbalance the darkness.
I hope so. It's a pleasure talking to you anytime. Next time with drinks, coffee, tea, anything. It'll be fun.
Yeah.
Lighter conversation.
I agree. All right, thank you everybody for being here. You can watch us on the replay. You can find all the links we've mentioned in the description below, and I will catch you next week on Exercise Your Rights. Thank you so much for being here, Benebell.
Thank you.